Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
This is part 8 of What If Ichigo Lost His Zanpakuto in the World of One Piece? Credit goes to Unseated 4th. Chapter 23. The Sacrifice. Whoa! So fast. Chopper panicked as the plesiosaur sped through the water with motor-like velocity. He held tightly to the dinosaur's body in efforts to keep from falling off and looked out at the jagged coast around them. They were headed for the sacrifice grounds. El Santino was wasting no time getting there, which while unpleasant, was appreciated. If any of his Nakama were hurt, Chopper wanted to reach them as soon as possible. On the shore the two had recently departed. Pascal stood and admired his handiwork. The former slaves had filed into Marion, and the Excel pod was now packed full with passengers. He turned to face Catherine. "Where do we go from here?" he asked. "We have someplace in mind," Catherine responded, "but now we need to join with the others on the ship." As the two continued their conversation, Nami turned to address Ichigo. "We should go to the other shore and meet the others here," she said. "Zoro said to meet back here in an hour. But we may not have that much time." She looked to the sky, and the ever-thinning protective cloud above. "I guess so," Ichigo said. "Do you know the way?" Quote, "I'm sure I can work it out if we get to higher ground," she said, and began jogging in the direction Dan had led Zoro. Ichigo followed close behind. Further along, Sanji was kicking himself. Or at least trying to. "Damn it," he cursed, quickly glancing up at the sky and again at his surroundings. "Who am I? The shitty Marimo." Quote, it seemed that in his desperation to join with the others in efforts to rescue Robin, he had forgotten to inquire on the marginally important detail of where exactly the sacrificial grounds happened to be. As such, he was racing across the island like some lost idiot. It wasn't too long before he ran into another lost idiot. "What are you doing, shit cook?" Zoro asked him. "Are you lost?" Quote, "Look who's talking." Sanji snapped at him. "Well, are you lost?" Another voice asked. Sanji looked over. "Oh, it's you, Dan. Seeing as you're here with the idiot, I guess none of us are." "Where exactly are we headed?" Quote, "Are you sure this is the right one?" Quote, "Well, the more tunnels we travel, the more likely the next one will be the right one." Usopp chose not to argue as he and Eustace adventured down yet another of Atlantica's many ship tubes. "Where will this one take us?" he asked as they wended along. For a while now, they'd been traveling the tubes, fending off attacking Marines as they went. But there were fewer Marines around now. The layer of cloud that had been protecting the city from the volcanic fumes had almost entirely worn away. Things were becoming dangerous. "Ah, this is the right one, I think," Winsdor announced. A quick scan of the port, and Usopp instantly spotted the defining figurehead of the Thousand Sunny. Finally, he sighed. "Now the only problem is them," Winsdor said, indicating to the heavy guard, who were now firing at them. "They just keep coming, don't they?" Usopp muttered, again loading the black Kabuto with ammo. Robin stood somewhat frigidly as the ceremony began. "And we commence," the obnoxious man began, as goes with any other eruption of MT. Jumble, we will willingly sacrifice another soul to satisfy the beliefs of the mighty Tenryubito who reign over Atlantica Island. Though this old tradition has been kept from much of the public eye over previous years, this fresh new sacrifice will keep that tradition consistent. The man continued his rambling and Robin grew bored. Most of his speech was unneeded padding intended to make something quite simple seem impressive. Eventually, he seemed to have finished. But he hadn't. He rambled on for another 5 minutes. Robin suppressed the urge to yawn. Finally, her time had come. One of the attendees, an annoying-looking man who'd been standing to the right of the female Tenryubito, stepped over and roughly shoved her toward the cliff edge. "Wait!" another Tenryubito demanded of him. Robin and the man looked over. "Yes, sire?" the man inquired. "Those are expensive sea-stone cuffs. Aid the Tenryubito, we can't waste them on her." Quote, "Very well," the man said. It happened nearly too quickly for Robin to comprehend. As soon as the click of the cuffs unlocking sounded, she found herself plummeting down the cliff, toward the harsh sea and rocks below. But she was free. And that was all that was needed. In a single movement, dozens of sets of arms extended outwards from her back, slowing her fall and catching her. From here, she flew upwards. Ascending over the cliff face, she discovered that the ceremony's attendees had quite a problem on their hands. Brooke was there, removing the blade from its cane and brandished it before his opponents. The cyborg boy from the cafe was there too, fighting off the many Marines who had suddenly been summoned. With a shrug she summoned some limbs, if only to contribute to the madness. Luffy dodged the swing of the uprooted tree as it plowed into the soil he'd recently been standing on. Moments ago, Daigen had unleashed his true power. The large Marine stood opposite him crouched in battle stance, his mass of crimson hair all the wilder and longer than it had been when their battle had commenced. "I have over 700 ways I can kill you with my hair," Daigen boasted, red locks re-securing themselves around the broad trunk of the tree and hauling it at Luffy once again with vigorous speed. Luffy skidded out of the way and the tree missed him by an inch. He gritted his teeth and put a hand to his middle, wincing slightly as he did so. He had found out the hard way that the tree was now hockey infused. "How much more of this can you take, I wonder?" Daigen voiced out loud, swinging the tree trunk into the clutches of his unnervingly long-legged hair. "I doubt you'll learn the true extent of my kami abilities at any rate. But I guess I may as well show you what I've got at least." Flinging the uprooted tree to the side, he lifted his arm, allowing a thick turret of hair to shoot forth from his underarm. "Gross," Luffy said, dodging the hair and looking on distastefully. "I don't have time to deal with this guy," he thought, glancing toward the coast. Quicker than Daigen could counteract, Luffy bit down on his thumb. "Gear third," he muttered, his fist inflating several times its normal size. "Armament." Hardening. His fist turned slate like iron, and he barreled it into his opponent, sending him flying backwards into the trees, breaking many. But Daigen wasn't beaten. "Don't act like you've never lost, Straw Hat." The enraged Vice Admiral fumed. "I've heard about your victories, yes, but I also know you've failed in the past." Quote, "What are you talking about?" Luffy asked with a scowl. A cunning grin broke out across the Vice Admiral's face. "That incident a few years back, Marineford, was it? From what I've heard, that wasn't your most triumphant of moments." Luffy frowned, his fist clenching. "What was your goal there anyway, Straw Hat? You'd planned to save someone, hadn't you? Now, who was it again?" Quote, "Shut up," Luffy muttered in a warning undertone. Daigen either hadn't heard or ignored him. Most likely the later. Ah, that's right. It was that no-good son of that worthless Roger from all those years back. Your so-called brother, am I right? You wanted to save him, didn't you? And remind me again, how did that go? Quote. Daigen wasn't anticipating such a powerful blow from his opponent to follow. Gasping, he looked up from his crater in the ground as Luffy loomed over him. I don't care how much of an idiot you are, Luffy spoke, you've just said the wrong thing. The hill of the Roostersaurus was in sight. Now all they needed to do was to reach the summit. Ichigo and Nami jogged alongside each other as they began their ascent. What is it, Ichigo? Nami asked. Ichigo looked over to her. Huh? He asked dumbly. Something's bothering you, don't try to hide it. Ichigo looked on ahead again, debating whether or not to talk to her. He then decided that she'd get it out of him regardless, and might as well speak. Do you think that, he began, unsure of how to continue. Nami eyed him curiously as they continued to jog along. Do I think that what? Quote. Do you think Luffy will still be mad at me? He asked lamely. Nami didn't respond for a moment. Are you still mad at him? She asked eventually. Well no, Ichigo said, I've barely had the time to think about that sort of thing over the past few hours. Well there you go, Nami answered. Luffy isn't the type to stay mad at things like this. Especially since he considers you a friend. Ichigo continued to run along silently, letting her words sink in. There was something he said while we were first fighting, he said after a moment, back when I was telling him off for going after Chopper instead of coming to get me. What did he say? Nami asked. He said that an older brother always looks out for a little brother, or something to that effect. Ichigo awaited a response, but Nami remained silent for some time. He said that, did he? She asked eventually, something in her voice Ichigo couldn't quite place. He chose to think nothing of it. Yeah, he did. Nami made no response as they continued running. Ichigo began to wonder if she would respond. That idiot, she whispered after a long pause, seemingly more to herself than to Ichigo. Ichigo raised an eyebrow in confusion. Are you crying? He questioned before he could stop himself. Maybe, Nami said, wiping her eyes. I don't quite understand, Ichigo said as they reached the top of the hill, am I missing something? Quote. Maybe, Nami repeated. Ichigo looked at her blankly, but chose not to question any further. It's because of his own brother, I suppose, Nami said quietly. Huh? His brother? Ichigo asked, confused, I didn't know he has a. His older brother died protecting him, Nami explained before Ichigo could finish his sentence. Her simple statement took a moment to truly make sense to Ichigo. What? Quote. Nami looked away. It was a couple of years ago now. He's never said anything about it, Ichigo said, surprised. It's something that's always on his mind though, Nami said, he sees it as his biggest failure. And he's constantly pushing himself to become stronger, so something like that never happens again. So he can protect everybody, Ichigo muttered. At once, the night from weeks back, not long before Shangpaio sprung to mind. I can see the others, Nami said indicating just over to the cliffs, looks like they're doing well. An explosion sounded from nearby, and a giant fist emerged from the trees. And that would be Luffy, Nami commented. I'm going to meet him, Ichigo decided, go and join the crew. We won't be far behind. Nami glanced at him for a moment and then nodded. Okay, she said, don't do anything stupid. Robin wasted no time in springing to action. With a wave of her arms, any officer within a 3-meter radius was sent to the ground by the various sets of newly sprouted appendages that incapacitated them, and there were cries from the surrounding officers as they realized that as well as a musical skeleton and semi-cyborg, their failed sacrifice was now attacking them. There was a low thud as Frankie landed beside her, apparently having come from up the cliff. Robin eyed him as some of their opponents fled. "What were you doing down there, Frankie?" she asked out of curiosity. "You were falling. So I was going to use my super abilities to catch you," Frankie replied, sounding vaguely disheartened that his intentions had not become reality. "You can do that another time," Robin promised, sending another guard to his knees with a wave of her arms. As Frankie stood and fought beside her, she quickly scanned her gaze across the grounds. It seemed as though the Tenryubito and their accomplices had fled the scene. As were many of the officers as well, especially now that Zoro and Sanji had appeared. Chopper was close by with that plesiosaur as well, and 2 of the other cafe people had arrived. As the last of the officers were either overcome or running away, the familiar flag and sails of the Thousand Sunny sailed into vision from around a bend, along with a smaller ship trailing behind it. "Hey!" Usopp's voice called from onboard as he waved at them, "We've got the ships." Quote, "Nice work, bro." Frankie congratulated him, giving a thumbs up in approval. The battle was over. "I'll have to admit it," Luffy said as the Vice Admiral began his descent to the ground. "People don't often think as little of me as they used to these days. I guess that somewhere in my journey I made a bit of a name for myself." Once Luffy had gotten fired up, there was no stopping his onslaught. Daigen and his hair suddenly meant nothing. Luffy's hard gaze softened. "I don't think I was the one with the sharp tongue and dull mind here." Daigen was unable to respond. However, a buzzing in his coat alerted Luffy to the presence of a Den Mushi. Whoever was on the other line seemed to be in panic. "Vice Admiral." The voice called, nearly swamped by static, "We have a problem up by the cliffs." The Tenryubito were unsuccessful in their attempted execution of one of the Straw Hats, and now the rest of the crew are arriving. "Do you hear me?" Quote. Luffy smiled to himself. His Nakama were safe. Daigen remained incapacitated and Luffy let him be, knowing that the Vice Admiral's subordinates would soon be on scene to attend him. And so he left the ruined clearing and headed for the coast. He hadn't been running for long when a voice caught his attention. "Luffy." Quote. Luffy looked over to see the familiar form of the orange-haired teen hurrying his way. "Moon Guy." He greeted in return, making no effort to hide his gladness in seeing his friend. Being back on the Thousand Sunny after such a crazy number of events was a delight Nami couldn't compare to anything else. "Ichigo went to meet with Luffy," she said, "they won't be long." "They'd better not be," Zoro noted, eyeing the rapidly growing volcanic cloud. Nearby, Robin spoke with the Dino Cafe members. "What's your plan now?" she asked. Eustace looked out to sea. "There's a certain group we've been thinking of seeking out for a while." "Oh?" Robin inquired as she looked on at Frankie and Winsor comparing their respective stomach fridge and stomach ovens. "Change is coming to the world," Dan said, "and I think you're one of the people who would understand that the most, Nico Robin." Robin smiled. "Indeed. We've been running for a few years," Catherine said. "I've come to like my new name. It's time we joined their cause." El Santino chirruped beside her. "Though I never truly understood what the meaning behind the sacrifice was in this place," Dan said. The sacrifice, Robin began, was an old tradition of this island, practiced by its original inhabitants thousands of years ago. It's said that there was something about the land that demanded the life force of a local at each sunrise at the summit of a temple that is no longer here. If a sacrifice was not offered each dawn, the island would suffer immediately and harshly. However, as the years passed, it seemed that sacrifices needed to be taken up less and less. Eventually, a sacrifice was only needed once a month. No one knows why this is the case. But not long after this, the ancestors of what makes up much of Atlantica's current population arrived. And with them, the Tenryubito. How do you know this? Quote, I went into some of the old archives and read a book. Back in the old times, sacrifices were made to appease the ancient entities the islanders feared. Today, however, it seems as though they are only to appease the whims of the world nobles residing here. Not surprising, breathed Zoro as he came past. Robin smiled. Some think that the restlessness of Mt. Jumble is the discontentment of the spirits of sacrifices from distant past and recent times. Spooky. Brooke stammered. Nami's attention dwindled from the conversation and she looked out over the water. In the thickly hanging smog, a red orb of light appeared on a far-off horizon line as an early morning sun began its ascent. That's our cue, Catherine said. With that, the Dino Cafe crew, the ex-slaves, Pascal and Marion bade their farewells and departed, bound for the opposite horizon. For Baltigo. It's over, Nami sighed in relief, putting her back to a wall and sliding to the ground. What a night. Ichigo ran alongside Luffy, towards the coast he'd seen the Sunny earlier. It was apparent that they needed to leave as soon as possible. Breathing was becoming more difficult, and many of the Marines had given up on their cause, opting to take their injured and sail out before the volcanic situation could become more dangerous. He glanced across to his pirate accomplice who by now was focused on the coast, to where his Nakama were waiting. Luffy, this was my fault, Ichigo said. I stood up to that bastard. I knew the consequences would be harsh, but I put everyone in danger. I did what I would have done. Luffy intervened before Ichigo could continue. Ichigo looked across in surprise. I heard the whole story from the cafe people, Luffy continued. You did what you needed to protect our friends, and other people as well. But that's what you do, isn't it, Ichigo? You protect people. You won't turn your back when the people you care about are at risk of getting hurt, and you only run if whatever threatens them won't be able to hurt them. Ichigo remained silent. And you know what? Luffy questioned as they continued running. What? Ichigo asked. Luffy's features curled into a grin. A couple of years back, I kicked one of those noble guys' asses. Ichigo caught himself smiling. That doesn't really surprise me, you know. I'm proud of you, Moon Guy, ha ha ha. Luffy, Ichigo addressed. Luffy inclined his head slightly to let Ichigo know he was listening. About what I said earlier, everything happens for a reason, right? If I hadn't been separated from Zangetsu, I probably would have tried getting home right away. I really don't know how to properly express this, but I'm really glad I met you. I'm glad I met you too, Ichigo, Luffy said, grinning. A few minutes later, the trees were thinning and the coast was all the more in sight. The ship shouldn't be too far off now, Ichigo said. We should be able to make it if. A sudden and painful jolt sent him to an abrupt stop. Ichigo doubled over, an unpleasant lurch almost sending him to his knees. Ichigo? The thrumming in his ears was nearly deafening. Oi, Ichigo. Luffy's voice shouted over the noise, as the pirate captain took him by the shoulders. "You okay? Snap out of it." Quote. Ichigo forcefully regained his bearings, clutching Luffy's upper arms to steady himself. "Sorry about that," he muttered whilst pulling himself together. "Let's just focus on getting back to the ship for now." Yash. Quote. However, they'd hardly made another dozen paces when rustling in the trees around them announced that they were not alone. What must have been the entirety of the remaining marine officers on the island were gathered around them, weapons at the ready. "We're surrounded," Ichigo observed. "That's not a problem," said Luffy, "you and I can take care of these guys easy." Ichigo nodded and stood with his back to Luffy's, ready to jump straight into combat. But the Marines were not alone either. They had not come on their own accord. With the increasing thickness of the volcanic smog, they probably wanted to go back to their ships. But there was someone keeping them here. Luffy frowned as the female Tenryubito came forth, the bubble around her head protecting her from the growing fumes. "What are you still doing here?" Quote. "Isn't it obvious?" the noble, Lilac, asked delicately. "Your crew and their accomplices humiliated us this night. And that man beside you is the reason for it all. But that is not why I have come. My qualm deals directly with you." "Huh?" Luffy questioned. "Your actions at the Sabaody archipelago a few years ago tarnished the Tenryubito name," Lilac explained, a dark glint in her eyes, "and I couldn't go letting myself pass up this opportunity to extract revenge." As Lilac continued to rattle away about an event long past, Ichigo felt the queasy weakness from his lack of Zanpakuto returning. Not now, he thought desperately, as he held tight to the borrowed katana in effort to keep from falling to his knees. He recalled what had been said in Shangpyo. Zangetsu was a part of his soul. He couldn't exert himself too much without him, without suffering consequences. Zangetsu, he thought, trying desperately to reach the misplaced fragment of his soul. "Stay with me. I won't be that much longer, I'm coming." It seemed that by now, Luffy had noticed his struggle. The young captain's focus drifted between the Shinigami and the Tenryubito, and through his inner ordeal, Ichigo vaguely noticed Luffy reposition himself in a stance that would defend himself as well as Ichigo should the noble order the Marines to attack. "Damn it," Ichigo thought to himself. "I can barely move." He glanced across the gathered group of Marines. There aren't many of them. Luffy could probably take them out easily. As such, Lilac's painstakingly shrill voice protruded his thoughts once again. It seemed as though she'd finally reached the conclusion of whatever she'd been going on about and was planning on acting on something. "I will now extract my revenge." Ichigo could never have prepared for himself for what followed. It all happened too fast for his mind in its current state. Lilac withdrew a slender pistol from within her robes and Luffy stood, ready to counter whatever she was planning to do with it. However, it didn't seem he was expecting the gun to be directed at Ichigo. Immobilized by the burden of his torn soul, Ichigo had no way of dodging, no way of counteracting the bullet that would be coming his way. "Stop it!" He vaguely heard Luffy yelling, "He has nothing to do with what happened at Sabaody." Quote. "Oh, I know," Lilac's voice cruelly responded. She pulled the trigger. The gun fired. Ichigo prepared himself the best his body would allow for the bullet that was sure to hit him. But a moment went by and nothing happened. Ichigo opened an eye and looked up. Luffy was standing firmly, a few meters between Ichigo and the Tenryubito, his back to Ichigo, clearly having taken the bullet himself. Ichigo exhaled, the tension in his body leaving him. trust Luffy to come jumping to his rescue in a situation like this. But his relief was short-lived. Ichigo eyed the way his friend stood, worriedly. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Slowly, seemingly hesitantly, Luffy raised a hand across to somewhere near his right shoulder. As he removed it, Ichigo took a sharp intake of air. An awful red liquid was smeared across Luffy's hand. Judging by its abundance, there was a lot more from where it had come from. Blood? Ichigo thought, it couldn't be, Luffy is. Lilac's high-pitched laughter interrupted his thoughts once again. How very selfless of you, Straw Hat. I was wondering how far you'd go to stop this bullet from reaching your friend. Tell me, how do these new sea stone bullets feel? Rather shocking, I'd imagine, to experience a bullet that can actually be shot into your body for once. Sea stone? Ichigo recalled the substance and the effects it had on fruit users. Does it hurt, Straw Hat? Having that bullet lodged inside of you? Lilac sneered. Ichigo felt his fingernails dig into the palms of his hands as white-hot fury simmered through his veins at the sight of Luffy's stance visibly slackening, the combination of sudden blood loss and sea stone beginning to have its effect on him. No response? Lilac questioned, how rude. This is your own fault anyway. Remember that. She turned to the Marines. Seize them, she ordered. The world seemed to fold in on itself as the Marines hurried forth at her command, some coming for himself and others going for Luffy. Luffy was hurt. Ichigo watched as the boy stumbled seemingly at a fraction of the speed he was probably stumbling in, his injuries finally overcoming him. All that filled Ichigo's ears was the shrill and cruel laughter of Lilac, and the several footsteps of the Marine officers as they scrambled to seize himself and the injured Luffy. But Ichigo wouldn't have any of that. His anger tore away any weakness that had been ailing him, and he felt his energy come tumbling back, perhaps from adrenaline, at an alarming rate. He barely even thought before acting. None of the Marines had even had the chance to advance another step when Ichigo covered the 3 or 4 meters between himself and Luffy in a fraction of a second. Equally fast, he gathered up the wounded captain as he finally collapsed, and hurried away from their enemies in a burst of shunpo. He came to stop behind a large sturdy boulder and quickly laid Luffy down to inspect the damage. Blood. Lots of blood. The bullet had struck Luffy in the chest immediately beside the joint of the right shoulder. There was only an entry wound, confirming that the bullet was still wedged in there somewhere. Furthermore, it was sea stone. Ichigo shook his head as he hurriedly tore off his shirt. Sea stone or otherwise, the bullet's removal would have to be left for Chopper. The best thing to do until then would be to slow the bleeding. Carefully, he bandaged his shirt tightly around Luffy's damaged shoulder, hoping the exposure to the weakening substance wouldn't hurt him too much further. If that was possible, at least. An infuriated screech sounded off in the distance, followed by a few extra gunfires. It seemed Lilac had not been anticipating their escape and had begun getting impatient, taking it out on the Marine officers. Ichigo, Luffy coughed weakly, eyes opening a small bit and meeting Ichigo's. Shut up, Ichigo instructed gently, you've been hurt. Luffy remained silent for half a second. I was shot, wasn't I? Quote. Ichigo tightened the makeshift tourniquet. At least the blood flow would ease off for the time being, yes. Sea stone, I thought it might have been, just before she tried to shoot you. Ichigo's eyes widened as he finished with the bandage. Then why did you? Luffy smiled. We made a promise, Ichigo, back in Shangpyo. Ichigo's mind quickly recalled the memory of himself sitting in the infirmary bed as the rubber pirate sat across from him, insisting on a firm handshake. "We're gonna find your Zangetsu no matter what." Luffy yelled determinedly, "So before then, don't you dare die. You got that, Moon Guy." Quote. "Of course, Luffy," Ichigo responded. "Yosh. It's a promise then." Luffy chirped as the two retracted from their handshake. Besides, Luffy breathed softly, his mind probably blurring over the events of the past week. A big brother always looks out for a little brother. Before Ichigo could respond, Luffy's body completely slackened. Ichigo cursed. He needed to get Luffy back to the ship, and fast. But the shouts and various footsteps were becoming closer, the Marines were closing in. Smoke from the volcano was spilling out over the western sector of Atlantica by now. Very soon it would become difficult to move. He had to act. Now. "I'm sorry," Ichigo whispered to Luffy's lifeless form as he stood, "things are going to get a little rough." Shifting the entirety of Luffy's weight into one arm and being careful not to disturb the gunshot wound, Ichigo slid his free hand over his face, materializing the bone mask which brought extra strength and speed. And then he charged, pulling forth the borrowed katana as he went. He didn't even manage to keep count of the officers he disabled as he went. He was going too fast to keep track. The Thousand Sunny was his destination, and he cut down only those who stood between himself and it. As he neared the cliff, he saw it. The comforting shape of the Thousand Sunny, bobbing in the churning water as it awaited them. But there was one more hopeful officer standing in his way, a certain glint in his eyes suggesting he was willing and able to put up a fight. Ichigo was not as equally willing. "Hado number 33, he said without expression, "Sokatsui." An explosion of white lightning smote the officer where he stood, immediately incapacitating him. Ichigo leapt past, the katana he'd borrowed from Zoro shattering into a million pieces and seeming to vaporize along with the mask. Having no time to mourn the loss of what had been a good stand-in sword, Ichigo's now free arm returned its attention to Luffy, making sure to have he was safely secured before making the step that would descend the cliff and take them over to the Sunny. Just a little further. The soles of his feet slammed into Sunny's wooden deck so hard that if his attention hadn't been elsewhere he'd be thinking about how they'd bruise. His arms trembled uncontrollably as the small weight they cradled lay helpless and unmoving. He heard his own voice as it frantically shouted something about Seastone. He heard the panicked shouts of Usopp and Chopper as they scurried about the deck. He heard Zoro's commanding tone as he stepped in and took charge, shouting instructions before Usopp hurried forth from his scrambling and relieved Ichigo of his load, disappeared to the infirmary after a worried Chopper. He watched as Zoro continued to shout commands, the rest of the crew following his instruction without question. He felt someone's hand clamp over his shoulder and became suddenly aware of the tears thickly falling down his face, and the fact he was trembling uncontrollably. With a sudden jolt, the ship left the water, becoming airborne. Behind them, Atlantica began to vanish into the distance, along with the danger of Mt. Jumble. The hectic night was over. And the Thousand Sunny shot through the sky, into the early morning. Chapter 24. Unbirthdays and Uncertainties. Ichigo wearily rested his head against the kitchen table, his body slouching in the seat. It had been over 2 days since Atlantica. Almost 60 hours, very few of which he'd gotten any sleep. He pulled his focus to the other side of the table, where Sanji sat surveying his hand of cards with idle interest. After a moment, the cook exhaled a plume of smoke and dumped a king of spades on top of the growing pile. There was a pause as Usopp flickered through his own hand, before placing a set of 3 jacks atop the king. Now it was Ichigo's turn again. He groaned as he gazed blankly at his own hand of cards. He barely even knew how this card game went. Right now, it was just a distraction. If he was lucky, it might lull him into a sleep. Though that hadn't been coming easily as of late, unfortunately. But there was nothing more to do at the moment. The ship was quiet. Unusually so. Ichigo's eyes trailed once again over to the door of the infirmary on the other side of the room, his thoughts with the captain who remained bedridden somewhere inside. The bullet had been designed to dissolve into the blood upon impact. As such, the sea stone was now circulating Luffy's system. Aside from cleaning and dressing the wound and assuring blood was circulating properly, there was not much that could be done. Nonetheless, Chopper had tirelessly worked on mending his captain to the extent of his abilities, until he was too exhausted to continue. He was currently resting in the infirmary near Luffy, in efforts to monitor him. Zoro was in there too, just sitting by, watching them and dozing occasionally as he had done the majority of the past 2 days. I should get started on dinner, Sanji decided after it became obvious all any of them were doing was placing random cards on top of the pile. Whatever the game's original intentions were had been forgotten. They were all too distracted. Ichigo and Usopp muttered their responses and the cook stood, heading toward the kitchen. Nami came and took his seat almost immediately. We need to prepare for what's coming next, she said. There are 2 islands in this next glade. We could land at either. Yeah, I remember, Usopp said. One is paradise, he shuddered, and the other is peril. Nami clamped her hands together almost desperately. Paradise, 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 she chanted to herself. We need somewhere peaceful after everything that happened in Atlantica. Even if we dock at the perilous island, I'm sure it's nothing we can't take on, Frankie supplied from across the room. Otherwise we'll all die violent deaths, Robin pondered at his side. Don't say things like that. Usopp snapped, covering his ears with his hands. The uncertainty alone is bad enough. Quote. Indeed, it is quite frightening, Brook shuddered as he entered from the outside deck, it's making my skin crawl. There was a short pause as he gasped to himself, though I don't have any skin, Ichigo completed for him. Brook, for lack of a better analogy, seemed to take it to heart. Ichigo-san, you can't do that, the skeleton said, suddenly becoming extremely depressed, you can't just take my line. Hey now, Ichigo said, slightly taken aback by his sudden change in demeanor, sorry, I didn't know it meant so much to you. Nami rolled her eyes and stood. I'm just saying, prepare yourselves for anything, she said, we'll be arriving in a few days. We're hoping for a forgotten paradise, but the new world could throw anything at us. Make sure you're ready for it. How did I get into this situation? An extremely grumpy Grimjow thought as he sat stupidly in the galley of a rough-looking pirate ship. It seemed he'd been thinking this thought a lot lately, and not for no good reason either. First he's been having a sparring match with that airheaded Kurosaki. Then he was left hanging for a few days before that obnoxious shopkeeper had whisked him away with some annoying Ichigo wannabe to a world of idiots and people who liked to chase them relentlessly. A few days earlier, Khan had been found by the Marines again. Instead of being a good little mod soul and leading them away, the idiot had decided to run back towards Grimjow, triggering the two of them to be chased around the town for the next 12 hours. It had been bloody annoying, the officers had just kept coming. Grimjow found himself wondering where they'd all come from, but among the shouts of Nami's brother and sees them, he hadn't had the time to ask. Eventually, the two agreed that staying on this particular island wouldn't be problematic. In a last-moment decision, they stowed away aboard a mean-looking ship as it departed from the docks. It was only a few minutes later that they realized the ship they'd clambered aboard belonged to none other than the kid pirates whom they'd encountered at that inn earlier, when one of the crew members entered the cellar they'd been residing in search of milk. Kid's welcoming had been surprisingly warm. He'd even let them camp out on the deck for the first couple of days, before finally deciding they were allowed inside the galley. He and Grimjow had hit it off ever since. If you consider the odd glare, hitting it off, at least, but to Grimjow it was progress. One of the more confronting members of the crew was the resident cook. At least Grimjow thought he was the cook. He seemed to be rather fond of cooking, burning things with a flame that escaped his mouth whenever he so desired. Sometimes at really inconvenient places or times. This man, he was called, was an interesting individual. As of now, Heat was pacing the galley, seemingly deep in thought as though he was planning something. Planning what exactly? Grimjow didn't have to wait long to find out. No sooner had Eustace Kid stepped out from the hallway leading to his quarters, the cook made his move. "I think it's someone's birthday," he said giddily. Grimjow looked on, slightly uncomfortable. "What do you mean?" Captain Kidd grunted with an eye roll, as though pondering what the strange man was up to today. "It's a very special birthday for a very special captain." "Not this again." "Happy birthday, Captain." "It's not my birthday," Kidd stated bluntly. "Yes it is." He'd insisted. "My birthday is in January." "No it isn't." Quote. "Yes it is." "Your birthday is today." "No it isn't." "You and I both know that it's been ages since your last birthday." "I guess it's been about 6 weeks since you last pulled this one on me," Kid admitted. "Wrong." Heat sang, "It's been 7.5. Happy birthday, Captain." Quote. "Where did you find him?" Grimjow asked. Kid glared. "None of your business." Ichigo quietly opened the door to the infirmary and slipped inside. The room was dark, but warm. His thoughts went back to the previous 2 nights. The first night had been the most tough, though the entire crew had been close on hand. He had watched from a spot in the corner as Nami insisted on helping Sanji as he cleared the kitchen after dinner. He'd watched later as Sanji approached Zoro and handed him a bottle of warm sake, muttering, "Just the way you like it, shitty Marimo." He'd seen the way Zoro had friendly cuffed Usopp on the shoulder as he came past the sniper while he stayed up fishing. The way Usopp had then kept Brook company as the musician stayed out on watch. The way Chopper had fussed over everyone once he was done tending to Luffy, even taking the time to tend to a small cut along Robin's arm that she'd already seen to. How Brook had played his violin softly to prompt Chopper into some much-needed rest, and lay the small reindeer across a couch in the infirmary once he'd fallen asleep, and the way Robin had gathered a few bottles of cola when she noticed Frankie looking less super than normal. The crew were close, Ichigo noticed at this moment more than ever before. They were a family, looking out for each other. He'd felt a pang of homesickness before Frankie had noticed him brooding and invited him over to hang out with him and some of the other guys as they quietly drank and talked amongst themselves, whilst their captain healed close by. Ichigo shut the door of the infirmary behind him and peered around the room. Zoro sat silently beside the bed, back resting against the wall, with his head hanging as though he was sleeping. Whether he was or not, Ichigo wasn't entirely sure. Chopper was curled into the swordsman's lap, his slow and even breathing indicating he was fast asleep and probably wouldn't wake for a while. Ichigo reached for a folded blanket on a nearby shelf and secured it around the pair. It may have been warm in the infirmary, but the days had been growing colder by the hour. The passive, graying sky above suggested that snow could fall once the temperature dropped a few more degrees, though Nami was certain it would clear up by the next day. Ichigo retracted his gaze from the small port window and looked down at the bed. Luffy was tucked beneath the covers and, for once, almost totally still. The steady rise and fall of his chest was comforting, though he was sickly pale, had a slight temperature and shivered on occasion. It showed that he was breathing. And that was better than the state than he'd been in a few days prior. Ichigo shook the memory away as he took a seat at Luffy's side. The idiot captain would be all right, and that was all that mattered. Even so, it was strange seeing him like this, so still, so exhausted. Bandages crisscrossed much of his upper body, particularly at and around his wounded shoulder. Ichigo reached over and lightly ran his fingers along one of the bandage strips, before assuring the blanket was properly in place. As he smoothed out the bed sheet, he discovered Luffy's arm draped limply over the side of the bed. Lifting the covers a fraction, he shifted the arm back onto the bed with the rest of the bandaged body, before readjusting the covers and glancing once again at the bandages adorning Luffy's upper body. He seemed so scrawny. It was hard to believe he was as strong as he was, but Ichigo knew what he'd seen him do. Smoothing the blankets one more time, he let out a sigh and contemplated what more he could do. "Hi," he said to Luffy's motionless form after a moment. Unsurprisingly, there was no response. "Well, he cleared his throat. He was never good with these kinds of words. He opted to just speak to Luffy as he usually would to avoid any awkwardness. "I suppose it would be kind of dumb to ask how you're going," he began. Luffy was silent, almost as though he wasn't there. But he was, and Ichigo knew that. If there were a small chance the pirate could hear him, Ichigo wanted to express himself sooner than later. "Thanks for helping me out back there," he continued. "I really owe you for that, but it shouldn't have come to this." He eyed the winding bandages again. "I'm still not entirely sure why I came to this place in the first place. Nor how I was able to be separated from Zangetsu. And you and everyone else would have even less of a clue than I do. And yet you're helping me out like this. You guys don't have any obligation to me at all, you know, and yet," he sighed, having run out of words to say. Silence again descended over the room as though Ichigo were alone. He searched for the right words he wanted to say. "Hang in there, okay?" He reached down and ruffled at Luffy's unkempt hair, before standing and turning for the room's exit. He was stopped by a voice at the opposite side of the room. "Ichigo." He spun around to see Zoro peering up from his slouched position. Ichigo swallowed. So he'd been awake this whole time. Ichigo quickly thought back on the things he'd said over the past few minutes, trying to assure he hadn't said anything too stupid. "Thanks," Zoro interrupted his thoughts, his single good eye meeting Ichigo's for getting Luffy back in time. Ichigo took a moment to process what it was he was referring to. "Don't mention it," he dismissed after a short while as he turned and left, closing the door quietly behind him. "I should be thanking him." He walked through the galley and out onto the deck, where he found much of the crew gathered despite the currently dreary weather. A few sat with fishing rods along the ship's edge, reeling in whatever they caught. "What's with all this?" Ichigo asked. "Luffy is hungry at the best of times," Sanji explained as he came out from preparing dinner. "When he wakes, he'll be ravenous. So we need to prepare. Besides, we should probably stock up before we get to this forgotten place." With a smile, Ichigo picked up one of the fishing rods and seated himself alongside Brook and Usopp, proceeding to cast the hook and bait into the ocean before him and wait for the telltale tug of a fish. Khan was on edge. He had been ever since he stepped onto this weird ship. It was unsettling. He couldn't relax in this kind of environment. The crew would always give him what he perceived as threatening looks. Challenges. The only time he was truly in his own solitude was while he was showering. He sighed contentedly as the drops of hot water hit Ichigo's body and proceeded to slide down his skin and allowed himself a moment to enjoy the peacefulness. However, it seemed that even the shower was no haven to solitude. Just as Khan was beginning to enjoy himself, there was a disturbance at the door and Killer entered. As luck would have it, the shower was communal. Killer stepped into the shower beside him, helmet still firmly in place as ever. Khan watched as the water from the showerhead trickled down the blue and white mask, catching into the small holes on occasion. After a pause, Killer looked over at him and Khan quickly glanced away. He'd had too many awkward encounters with this guy as it was. A close encounter while showering was not something Khan desired. Nor was the awkward silence that would ensue should nothing happen at all. Khan cleared his throat. "So," he began, "what's up with heat and all this birthday business?" he asked. Killer shrugged, Khan's presence not affecting him in the slightest. At least, it seemed to not affect him. Khan couldn't see his face after all. "He often comes out with weird things like this," he said. "I guess it's his own way of expressing affection for the captain. He hasn't pulled the birthday one in a while though." "Strange," Khan muttered as a disturbance sounded from upstairs. "That would probably be the cake part," Killer pondered. "The cake part?" questioned Khan. Killer nodded. "There's always a cake part." Sure enough, Heat's loud singing voice as well as a second one that seemed to be wires. "He joins in sometimes for the fun of it," Killer noted, began chanting some shocking render of what might have once been the birthday song. "Wow," Khan admitted. "Sometimes he plans it days in advance," Killer said. "He bakes a large cake and hides in it overnight. Then he jumps out of it when the captain comes out in the morning." "What a weird guy," Khan said as yet another disturbance sounded. "Fine." Kid's voice roared with fury from somewhere above them. "I give in. It's my birthday, there you go. Now shut up." A victorious cry came from what could only have been Heat. "Happy birthday, Captain." Quote. Wishram stood steadily and resisted the urge to fidget in his place as Shearwater paced the shadows before him and the 9 other sea nymphs, Potoro trailing not far behind him. "I have been closely monitoring our target's movements with the aid of Yingerna's abilities," he said in his smooth baritone. The female sea nymph in question smiled slightly, barely managing to hide her true contempt in having served greater purpose to their master. "In doing so, I have made a few discoveries," Shearwater continued, pacing further into the shadows so that the sea nymphs almost had to squint to see them. "What have you discovered, Boss Shearwater?" Potoro asked, his thin weedy voice never failing to prod at Wishram's nerves. Shearwater turned back to his audience, his deep green eyes reflecting the low light. It seems that Kurosaki Ichigo and his accomplices are headed for that island. There was no response, and yet in the silence, a response resounded. A few of the sea nymphs briefly stole glances at Wishram, quickly turning away should he return their stares. He sighed and shut his eyes, but that didn't shut out the hushed whispers of the others. He opened them in time to glance. Sedna observed him with her icy gaze, not bothering to look away even when she knew he'd spotted her. As though it was expected of him, he chose to clear his throat and speak up. "I hope, for their sake, that they are luckier than most." Chapter 25. Welcome to silence. It wasn't an easy task to brush your hair when you had no fingers. Strands of hair would escape easy grasp and were prompted into having minds of their own, resulting in a tangled mess that was often filled with more knots than when the brushing commenced. Despite this, Sedna did what she could with what she had. "Would you like me to help you with that?" Yingarna stood in the white rocky outcropping of a doorway, her own hair loose and wild as it naturally fell. "If you don't mind," Sedna said with a shrug. She quite liked the other woman's presence. Yingarna took the invitation and entered the room, seating herself behind Sedna as she took the brush and began combing through the tangled white hair. "Where's Wishram?" Sedna asked once Yingarna had eased into some sort of rhythm. Yingarna worked on entangling what had been a particularly persistent knot before answering. "He's locked himself in his quarters." Sedna quietly winced as her kin continued to pull the brush through her hair. The dark-skinned woman wasn't very gentle. "Ah, I figured he'd do that." "It's no wonder though," Yingarna continued. "You know what he gets whenever Erebus is mentioned. And now Shearwater's going to be focused there for however long it takes those pirates to escape, assuming they ever do. Not to mention they're not even there yet, and already Shearwater's watching that place. It must be tough." "It's been tough on us all," Sedna admitted, her eyes wandering down a long hallway. "You know, he's been moving lately. Our life source." "I am aware of that," Yingarna said with a nod. "It seems as though everything is finally starting to come together. After all these years. The final pieces are nearly in place." "How do you know Kurosaki's not going to die in Erebus?" Quote, "I don't. Shearwater does. And he's never been wrong before." As Nami had predicted, the sun was out and the sky was clear. But there was an uncanny chill in the air. The days were becoming shorter. The foreboding feeling Ichigo had experienced whenever he'd thought of the forgotten before was pulsing stronger than ever, and the more he looked into the endlessly blue sky, the less safe everything seemed. He chose to put the thoughts out of his mind. He had other things to worry about. Luffy was still out of action, though Chopper had said he was improving and would be up soon. As such, Sanji had prepared more food than Ichigo had ever seen on the ship and was ready to prepare even more should more sea life be caught. So Ichigo kept to fishing as he had done over the past 2 days. Today, however, there'd been no luck. They'd only had one near catch all day, when Brook hadn't been paying attention while casting his line and had been pulled right in by a particularly strong tug from some sort of large fish. "Make sure you don't lose that fish," Sanji had shouted as he dived in to assist the musician. Unfortunately, the fish had gotten away. Even more unfortunately, it had been the only fish, or sign of a fish, all day. It had been lucky that they'd gone fishing when they did earlier. This part of the ocean didn't seem to be housing much life at all at the moment. Ichigo decided that any further effort to go fishing at this point was probably useless. Usopp, however, didn't seem to think so. "What are you doing?" Ichigo asked, eyeing the extensive net the sniper was hauling over. "Maybe we can catch some fish with this," Usopp responded as he dumped the large net into the sea. Ichigo watched it hit the water and slowly sink, as Usopp secured it to the rails with rope. "We'll keep it there," he said, "that way we're bound to catch something eventually." "Alright," Ichigo agreed, watching the net bob up and down beside the ship. Everything ached. A painful throbbing pulsed from his right shoulder up and down his entire body. It was the first thing he was aware of, before anything of his surroundings came into bearing. It was slow but definite, and was enough to remind him he was still alive. Slowly, his awareness expanded to his surroundings. The touch of the warm blanket. The smell of various medicine mixtures. The sound of muffled voices somewhere outside. Luffy peeled his eyes open, the world around him seeming to fuzz and blur into distorted shapes. He blinked and it became clearer. Again, and it was almost like normal. The infirmary of the Sunny, what was he doing here? His lungs expanded and constricted painfully with each breath as he scrunched his eyes shut and tried to recall. His memory clicked into place. Atlantica. The volcano. The Tenryubito. Where were his nakama? Last time he'd woken like this had been. He flung off his covers, the blanket touching the ground after he'd already crossed the room and reached the door. He wrenched it open and ambled out into the dining room, where he discovered part of the crew gathered. "Luffy!" Sanji exclaimed in surprise, his expression a mix of anxiety and relief. Nami reacted in a similar manner beside him. "How do you feel, bro?" Frankie asked. Luffy didn't make any response other than scan the room for who he could find. The three of them seemed fine and that was good. But Luffy's mind had wandered to the rest of the crew. Where are the others? He could feel the urgency in his voice. "Robin is up on the deck," Nami responded with a contrasting gentle calmness. "I just came in from talking to her. Zoro finally left your room about an hour ago because he needed to do some training. He's lifting some of those weights of his up in the crow's nest right now. Chopper is out on the deck because we made him go and get some fresh air. Usopp and Ichigo are outside fishing, or at least trying to. Brook is playing music down in the aqua room, as you can hear. And the rest of us are right here in the galley. Everyone is here, on the Sunny?" Luffy questioned, his heart racing in his chest. "Yes, everyone's here," Sanji assured him, "everyone's alright. Except you, of course. You've been completely out of it for the past 4 days, you know." Luffy's memory continued to recollect itself. The pain of the sea stone as it pierced through his bloodstream, and the urgent drive to protect his nakama before it was too late. The burst of energy left him as soon as it had come. Luffy suddenly felt dizzy, the room spun and blurred once again, and he struggled to grab hold of a steady object to support himself. He heard Nami shout something, before a large set of hands broke his fall. "Easy there, bro," Frankie's voice came from somewhere above him. "I don't think you'll feel very super if you keep running around like this at the moment." Ellipsis. Opening his eyes the second time was slightly easier. Luffy blinked and again took in his surroundings, finding that he was back in the infirmary and laying in the bed. "Luffy." Chopper's voice came from beside him, before the little reindeer leapt onto the bed and hugged his captain around the middle. "You're awake. I'm so happy." Quote. Luffy returned the hug with one arm, and then tried to sit upright but winced. Chopper quickly pulled back. "Don't push yourself," he said. "He already did," Sanji's voice came from out in the galley. "Food," Luffy groaned as he lay back into the pillow. "Welcome back, Captain," Zoro said, from where he stood in the doorframe. "Zoro," Luffy said with a smile. "You'd better have plenty prepared, cook," Zoro called over to Sanji, "otherwise he'll probably start eating the ship." "Frankie won't like that." "That's right. I super wouldn't." Frankie's voice came from near Sanji as Chopper switched to heavy point to help Luffy sit upright. "The rest of the crew are glad to know you're alright," Chopper said. "Sanji even prepared a feast." "A feast?" Luffy repeated, eyes shining and mouth watering. "Yes, but I need to talk to you about your condition before you go." "How bad is it?" Luffy asked. "Can I still eat meat?" Quote. "Yes," Chopper replied, "but since it's sea stone, your abilities will temporarily be affected." Luffy tried stretching his left arm across the room, but barely made it halfway. He then tried the same with his right and got nothing but a searing pain. He quickly grabbed his right shoulder, wincing and prompting Chopper to fuss somewhat. "I can't stretch like normal," he admitted with a frown once he'd recovered. "Do you know how long this will last, Chopper?" Quote. "A few weeks at most," Chopper answered, "but over that time the sea stone will leave your system and you'll be able to stretch again like normal." "You mean I get to crap it out?" Luffy questioned, suddenly becoming excited. "Yes. Better out than in," Zoro muttered. "But until you have full use of your abilities again, you need to take things easy," Chopper cautioned. "You should get lots of rest." "I've been resting for days though," Luffy argued as he pulled himself out of the bed. "How many meals have I missed? It's got to be at least 15 or 20 by now." "You'd better go and eat then," Chopper advised. Without further prompting, he was out in the galley and earnestly pestering the cook. "Sanji. Food." Quote. As anticipated, Luffy was ravenous. Ichigo looked on in amazement as the captain devoured all food within a meter radius in a matter of seconds, before expanding his circle of consumption and devouring other dishes. Although he'd been with the pirates for several weeks already, Luffy's colossal appetite never failed to astound him. And right now was no exception. His eyes widened as the captain, who had up until a few hours ago been comatose, swallowed an entire lobster, claws and all. "Be careful about what you eat, Luffy," Chopper warned. "Your stomach isn't as strong as it normally is." But the reindeer seemed to go by unheard as Luffy proceeded to consume a whole leg of meat faster than he could say anything more. An hour went by, and Luffy seemed relatively content with his meal. He'd taken to scurrying up and down the deck and laughing with Usopp. He was notably less energetic than usual, however. Ichigo noticed when he slowed his running pace to a stop and leant against the wall of the galley to catch his breath. "So how are you feeling, Luffy?" Robin asked, hiding any slight concern beneath her passive exterior. Luffy caught his breath and straightened up from the wall, flexed his arm and grinned. "I feel much better now. You know what they say, what kills you makes you stronger." Robin laughed. "Really?" Exclamation mark. Chopper blurted, eyes wide. "That's not how it goes," Zoro reprimanded him. "If you were killed, you wouldn't be around to get stronger." Quote. Brook chose that moment to pop up seemingly out of nowhere. "Actually, Zoro-san," he stated, "I've been around to get stronger and I'm Dia." "Shut up." Quote. The more Ichigo paid close attention throughout the evening, the clearer it became that Luffy had not yet completely healed. He was unsteady on his feet. On more than one occasion, he stumbled and would have fallen were it not for a close-by crew member running to catch him. At some point in the night, Ichigo noticed him sway dangerously on the staircase and quickly steadied him before he could meet the ground. He held him in place for a brief moment before he noticed Luffy wincing, clearly in pain, and noticed that he'd grabbed Luffy's injured shoulder in order to stop the fall. With slight guilt, Ichigo withdrew the hold on the injured area and Luffy continued on as though it hadn't occurred. He grinned his thanks, but Ichigo could detect the mild frustration somewhere beneath his smiling exterior. Furthermore, it seemed he wasn't able to cope with the food as well as he normally may have. After his initial consumption, he barely ate anything. In fact, it seemed as though he was avoiding the food, only eating any if he thought someone would make a remark if he didn't. The others seemed to notice this as well, however, and chose to make no comment when Luffy wordlessly declined offers of food. As the evening continued, the crew settled into more of a party-like state. Ichigo smiled and laughed as the others went about their typical party routines, minus Luffy's eating. "How many times are you planning on singing that?" he questioned Usopp after the sniper sang the same "Great Captain Usopp" song for the 12th time in a row. "I don't know," Usopp shrugged, somehow managing to keep balance atop the tower of chairs and tables he'd built, however many times it takes. "One time I even sang the same song over 900 times in a row." Quote, "Yeah right," Ichigo said with a laugh. "He actually did," Nami said. "What?" Exclamation mark. "You actually did that? Why?" Quote. Usopp chuckled to himself and folded his arms, seeming to have gotten the response he was after. "Well, you see, Ichigo-kun, it was many years ago now. At one point during our adventures, I'd been surrounded by thousands of enemies. But then, single-handedly, I, the great Captain Usopp, blasted them all away with a single fire of my kabuto and saved the day. That part, however, didn't happen," Nami contributed. "I guessed as much," Ichigo said as Usopp began to spin the tale into something even more ridiculous than it already was. "Any sake for you, Ichigo?" Sanji offered as he came past. "That's probably not a good idea," Ichigo declined. "Yeah, probably not," Sanji agreed. "One sip and you'll be up the mast pretending you're a flag or something. It's not often that you get to make fun of other people for being lightweights, Cook." Zoro said with a laugh. "What are you implying, Marimo?" Quote, "What do you think I'm implying? Even Nami can drink more than you." "I don't think that's a good example," Usopp said, as Nami downed her 14th glass of the stuff without hassle. Brook played a fast tune on his violin as Frankie approached. "Hey Brook, did you know that you can hook that guitar of yours up to the new intercom system?" the cyborg asked. Brook stopped playing the tune. "Can I?" he asked, yo-ho-ho. "How splendid. Let's do that right now then." Within the next 10 minutes, Brook had been hooked up to the intercom and was ready to rock. Frankie had also positioned an array of small, round mirrors around the deck. What purpose they served, however, Ichigo could only guess. Yay! A concert! Luffy cheered, quickly taking a seat somewhere near the front. Within a few moments, Brook, or rather the Soul King, began playing the first few notes of his song. "Are you ready?" Exclamation mark. The Soul King asked his audience. "Yeah." The more enthusiastic handful of his audience responded in excitement. The Soul King played the first notes of the song again, this time proceeding with the entirety of the piece, the tune of his voice and guitar echoing throughout the ship and ocean around them. Ichigo was really enjoying it, as were the crew. It was no wonder the guy had become such a world-renowned musician in his time. He soon reached a complicated guitar solo, though seemed to have something more prepared. "Take it away, Frankie-san." Quote, "You got it, bro." The shipwright replied. Ichigo at once saw what the mirrors were for. Super nipple light spectacular. Frankie shouted. At once 2 beams of white light shot forth from his chest and into the nearest mirrors. The lights bounced from mirror to mirror in all sorts of angles as they flashed a variety of neon colors in time with the music, giving Brooke's performance a true rock concert quality. "They're good," Ichigo said a few minutes into the piece. "I might tell them to tone it down in a moment though," Nami said. "If they get much louder or flashier they could attract unwanted attention." However, she seemed to have gone unheard. "Take it away, Usopp-san," the Soul King instructed. "Yosh," Usopp said as he came past and stood in the middle of the deck, wielding the black kabuto and using it to aim some sort of missile into the sky. "Now for the fireworks." Quote. Before Nami could stop him, he released. The firework shot up into the night sky, where it bloomed. It was spectacular. Ichigo looked on in open-mouthed amazement as the missile split into 2 phoenix-like beings, which began to glide around the ship, their 2 different flight patterns criss-crossing one another in an ornate display of color and calculation. Finally, the 2 birds met about 40 meters above the ship, from where they exploded in one massive flower-like firework which covered nearly the entirety of the night sky, before raining down in shimmering tendrils of light. The crew were greatly entertained by the display. Even Nami was impressed, before she realized the display would be a sure-fire way of being discovered should any enemy ships be in the area, and proceeded to whack Usopp for his risky but flamboyant exploit. From there, the partying seemed to die down considerably. A Soul King concert complete with flashing lights and fireworks was a hard act to follow. Furthermore, everything seemed finally to be too much for Luffy. Ichigo looked over to see the captain leaning over the side of the ship and puking up all he'd eaten in the past day as Zoro stood by and slowly patted his back. From what Ichigo could gather, Luffy hadn't been sick like this before. As Chopper had anticipated, the sea stone in his body restricted every aspect of his stretching abilities, including his stomach, which now couldn't keep up with its owner's appetite. Luffy was devastated. "Why would food do this to me, Zoro?" He sobbed dryly before barfing again. Ichigo heard the first mate mutter some sort of comforting words to his captain as he continued to rub his back in a circular motion. "We should be arriving sometime in the morning," Nami said, pulling a coat firmly over her shoulders. "Dress warmly. It's going to be cold." "It already is," Usopp chattered from beside her. And so, the crew retired to their various quarters for the night. Chopper had insisted that Luffy spend another night in the infirmary, to which the relatively unstretchy captain didn't argue as Zoro led him away. Nami returned to the women's quarters soon after, making sure the others knew to be prepared for the morning. Ichigo sat cross-legged on deck near the figurehead and stared out into the vacant night. Last night he'd slept the night through, so tonight he'd volunteered to keep watch. He watched the silver glow of the moon shine through the cloud cover that blocked the stars. It was a full moon, or not far from one at least. This would be the second full moon during his time here. The second full moon without Zangetsu. Ichigo folded his legs up into his body and folded his arms around them, hugging his knees closer in. It was a strange type of loneliness. A very intimate sort. He was almost lost in his thoughts when footsteps sounded from the deck behind him as Brooke wandered over and took a seat nearby. Ichigo glanced over. The musician had clearly come to keep him company. A friendly gesture. "Hey," Ichigo greeted him. "Hello there, Ichigo-san," Brooke returned the greeting. "How are you this evening?" "It's rather icy, don't you think?" "I'm chilled to the bone." Quote. Ichigo sighed but smiled as Brook proceeded to laugh cheerfully at his own joke. "That was a good concert you put on earlier," he said. "Why thank you, Ichigo-san," Brook responded. "I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did." Quote, "It's been a long day," Ichigo said, "and you had last night's watch. Aren't you going to get any rest?" Quote, No, it's fine," Brook insisted. Ichigo nodded and chose not to argue any further. Perhaps he could use some company tonight. "I'll sleep when I'm dead." Ichigo stopped nodding immediately and gazed at him blankly for a moment, before Brook realized what he had just said. "Oh wait. I already am dead. Better get cracking then, yohahoho." Quote. And before Ichigo could say anything more, the skeleton was snoring beside him. "You did that on purpose," Ichigo snapped, but the musician was already far gone. Ichigo shook his head and returned his attention to the moon, but withdrew from the thoughts of solitude that had been concerning him earlier, especially when Zoro came by to take over the watch early in the morning. Ichigo chose to stay outside despite the cold, chatting to the swordsman on occasion and lightly dozing the rest of the time until he eventually reached sleep. Ellipsis. It was morning. Or at least it should have been. The dark night-like sky didn't seem to be letting up. Ichigo yawned and blinked back sleep in slight confusion. His dreams had been vivid and gripping. But he couldn't remember what they'd been about. He glanced at the sky again. Perhaps dawn was still a few hours away yet. Nonetheless, quite a few of the others had already arisen. Robin came out from up in the library, hair in place as it had been in the evening, and barely looking fazed. Ichigo wondered if she'd even slept at all. Sanji was up next, probably intending to get an early start on breakfast. A very early start, if the sky was of any indication. Ichigo noticed as the cook paused momentarily to look at the dark sky, before glancing at the clock in the galley and shrugging as he headed for the pantry. Ichigo leant his head against the wall and contemplated the strange phenomena, but also tried to remember the dream. All he could remember of it was that it had seemed familiar to him when he dreamed it. Perhaps if he went back to sleep he'd recall it again. "Oi, Ichigo." Ichigo snapped out of his near slumber and looked to the swordsman. Zoro, however, wasn't returning his gaze. Instead, he was staring straight ahead, out over the horizon. Ichigo followed his line of sight until he found what he was inevitably observing. From the distant night, a misty form had loomed into existence on the horizon. One of the two isles of the second last glade. The Forgotten. Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. My apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening or night. See you next time, faves.